getting a man into space. They beat us with the satellite, but we were going to beat them getting a man into space. And our first astronaut selected was Alan Shepard. He thought he was going to be the first human into space. Whoops, not so fast. On April 12, 1961, the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin, one orbit around the Earth. He became not only the first human into space, but first human to orbit the Earth. And it wasn't until about 3 weeks later that Alan Shepard finally went up. However, Alan Shepard was not able to go into orbit. Why? Because that rocket right over there, over your shoulder, is an Atlas booster, and the Atlas booster wasn't quite ready for prime time. And you can tell that by looking at this piece of what looks like space junk hanging in the corner up there. That is actually the hatch cover off the Mercury capsule from Mercury Atlas 1, which unfortunately blew up shortly after leaving the pad. And that capsule hatch cover probably landed in the Atlantic Ocean. It probably washed up on one of our local beaches, where it was discovered by someone who probably had no clue what it was and took it to the local junkyard, where it was discovered by a NASA engineer and said, "We got to get this out of here," and he brought it back to us. So you're looking at a piece of space history right there. John Glenn on the Atlas booster and go into orbit. I'm going to have to sneak through here if I can. Can I get through here? Because I've got to show you all something. Oops, I'm sorry. All right, this is the Mercury space capsule. There's a couple of things you'll notice about it. First of all, it has this tower sitting on the top. Anybody know what that is? That's it. It's the escape tower. It's got 3 little rocket motors on it. They're solid fuel. And remember, we've had some problems with Atlas. So the idea behind this is if that rocket starts to explode underneath the capsule senses it, and it fires those 3 rockets, which pulls the capsule away to safety. And then this comes off, the parachute's open, and lowers the capsule back with its astronaut inside, back down to safety. The next thing about this capsule, it has 2 things on the bottom. It has a heat shield over here, which is an ablative substance, which is a fancy way of saying that it kind of burns off and takes all the heat with it as that comes back through the atmosphere. Coming through the atmosphere at those kinds of speeds creates an incredible amount of heat, and so we have to protect our astronaut from that. The next thing you'll see on the bottom is these 3 little rocket motors down here, and those are called retro rockets. The idea behind retro rockets is to get us out of orbit. Anybody remember Newton's 3rd law of motion? No, first law of motion. An object in motion tends to stay in motion, right? Well, when you're up there in orbit and there's no friction, there's nowhere to get down except by slowing down. So you turn the capsule around, you fire those rockets in the reverse direction, it slows it down enough, and gravity does the rest, and you come back to Earth. Now, of course, you want to land in a certain place, right? You don't want to land just anywhere. Have you all seen the movie Hidden Figures?
Yes,
yes. Wonderful movie. It's about those ladies who were very instrumental in the mathematics behind that landing process. You have to know 3 things. You have to know how much power, how much force to exert with these motors. You have to know how long to burn them, and you have to know when to burn them, so that the capsule comes down somewhere near that Navy ship that's going to pick them up. All right, now something kind of interesting happened during John Glenn's mission. A light came on down in the control room. John Glenn didn't see it. It wasn't in his capsule. It came on that said this heat shield was loose. Well, that could have been a real problem, because if the heat shield comes off, what happens? The capsule burns up. The engineers on the ground made 2 quick decisions. The first thing they decided was not to tell John Glenn. You laugh. The logic is that if worst happened and the capsule vaporized coming back in, John Glenn would never know what hit him. There wasn't any point in worrying him about something that he had no control over. They'd rather have him concentrating on the mission at hand, so they never told him. The second thing they decided to do was this retro package, which is connected with those 3 strap-like things. They decided to keep it on longer as they came through the atmosphere, hoping that that would help keep the heat shield in place. Well, we all know that John Glenn came back safely. When they got the capsule back on the ground, they discovered that the heat shield wasn't loose, it was a sensor problem. This is the stepping stone between Mercury, which was just put your toe in the water, to actually getting us to the moon. And by 1961, we knew we were going to the moon. Why? Because President Kennedy told us we were going to the moon in that famous speech, right? So now remember, we only had 6 flyable astronauts, and then after John Glenn flew, we only had 5. Because after John Glenn's mission, NASA decided to ground John Glenn. They recognized the dangers of these flights, and now John Glenn was a national hero, first American in orbit, and they said, John, you can't fly anymore. So now we got 5 flyable astronauts. So what did they do? In 1962, they picked 9 more astronauts, and you can see them in that picture up there. The Mercury 7 are at the table, and the next 9 above them. There's some pretty famous names in that picture, like Neil Armstrong for one. Right? And shortly after that, they picked another 14, so we're up to about 25 astronauts, and those are the astronauts that flew Gemini and Apollo. Before I leave, why was that important? It was important because the Russians did not land in their capsules in those days. Remember, we landed on water, they landed on hard ground, and the Russian engineers were afraid that that big bump at the bottom might be a little bit too much for their cosmonauts, and so they actually ejected from their capsules at about 20,000 feet and landed in their own personal parachutes. You look distressed. You would have liked to have done that? So, actually it can be said that John Glenn was the first human being to orbit the Earth and land in the same capsule that he took off in. Now that's splitting hairs, but we'll take bragging rights wherever we can, right? All right, Valentina Tereshkova, first female in space. Now, I also told you we had no female astronauts, again, because of the rule about test pilots. However, one of the doctors that tested our original Mercury astronauts decided they wanted to test some women. So 19 female aviators were invited to go through those tests, and of the 19, 13 of them passed the initial tests. They never went on to any further tests, but those 13 were affectionately known as the Mercury 13. They never got to fly into space. Now, one of them was a lady by the name of Wally Funk. Anybody heard of Wally Funk? All right, Wally Funk today is the oldest female ever to have flown into space, because a few years ago she actually went up, in fact it might have been last year or the year before, she went up on one of the guy that runs Blue Origin. She went up on a Blue Origin flight. It was a suborbital flight, but she got high enough to have been considered having flown in space. Now, across the hall there is a room that's dedicated to all the females that have flown in space. It's not on the tour, but feel free to look through it after the tour. And there's a picture in there of Wally Funk with a big smile on her face because she finally got to get to fly into space, and she was one of the original Mercury 13. Quite a lady. All right, back to who Artemis was. Artemis was Apollo's twin sister. I think it's a sister. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit briefly about Artemis shortly. Anyway, this rocket here is so big that it's 363 feet tall. It's taller than a football field is long. And if you look down here as you pass by, you can see a little bit model of a human being, an engineer standing at the bottom of it, and he is completely dwarfed by this rocket. It's huge. It's just a monster rocket compared to everything else we had ever launched. Now, it does have some similarities. First thing you'll notice, it's a 3-stage rocket. Remember I said way back there, I said staging is important. And why is staging important? Because of weight. You don't want to have to carry useless weight along with you. And so the way staging works is you light off the first stage, it burns through all its fuel. When its fuel is depleted, you drop it off and it falls back to Earth and burns up on its way back through the atmosphere. But in this case, we're carrying liquid hydrogen instead of kerosene. It had not been done before because a hydrogen atom is much smaller than an oxygen atom. It's very difficult to contain it. You get leaks frequently. And you also have to cool it down to a much colder temperature than oxygen to make a liquid out of it. So anyway, first rocket ever to propel human beings into space using hydrogen. So primitive that, let me preface this by each one of these consoles is designed to support one engineering system, right? And so there were about 40 engineering systems on the space shuttle between the orbiter, solid rocket boosters, and the external tank. All had to be monitored, right? So about 40 systems. And if you look at that picture up there, you can see what the firing room looked like. It's just filled with those consoles with engineers monitoring all the shuttle systems. Now, your cell phone has more computing power than that entire firing room.
Yeah.
That's how primitive those computers were. And yet, we launched space shuttles for 30 years using that primitive system with some minor upgrades along the way, but basically the same system in 2011 as we started with in 1981 when the first shuttle was launched. Now, I'm not going to make you turn around, but as you get up, or if you can see behind you, there are two models behind you. The first one in the back is what we call the Payload Integration Test Facility, which is basically a mock-up of the payload bay of the space shuttle. So we had to have that mock-up because before we ever loaded a payload into the orbiter's cargo bay, we want to make sure everything worked. We wanted to make sure it fit properly, that all the fittings that held the cargo in place were all lined up properly, that all the electrical cables fit properly, and that we could put power on the payload and make sure the payload worked before we put it into the cargo bay of the orbiter. How embarrassing would it be to try and put a cargo in the cargo bay and it either didn't fit or it didn't work? So we tested everything first. The next model immediately behind you is a model of what we call the OPF, or Orbiter Processing Facility. And you might note that I use the term orbiter. Okay? In common parlance, people call it the space shuttle, but in actuality, the space shuttle is the entire system that consists of the orbiter, the solid rocket boosters, and the external tank. That is the space shuttle. The orbiter is just that one vehicle. But in any event, there's 5 things we had to do with the orbiter before we could launch it. When it came back, the very first thing we have to do is we would have to deconfigure it. We would have to take out all the holding devices that held the previous payload. We'd have to take out all the electrical cables. Anything that had to do with that previous payload all had to be taken out, deconfigured. The second thing we'd have to do is reconfigure it for the next mission. New holding devices, new cabling, all the things that would then accommodate that next payload. The third thing we would have to do is we would have to fix anything that was broken. Like any human-made vehicle, things break, right? And so astronauts come back from a mission and they would have a checklist of things that weren't working 100% correctly. And so the technicians on the ground would fix all those things that were broken. And the fourth thing we would have to do would be to test that vehicle thoroughly to make sure it's ready to go on the next mission. Now, there's one more thing we did in the OPF, but it wasn't a regular routine kind of thing, and that was minor upgrades. Anytime there was a small upgrade, like maybe some new instrumentation in the cockpit, that could be done locally. Any major upgrades, the vehicle would have to be flown back out to California to the factory where it was initially built, and they would do the major upgrades out there. The first thing you'll notice is we have this thing here, which looks like a giant tractor, and it really is big. If you were standing next to it, you'd come up about that high. These treads on this thing are huge. In fact, each individual tread weighs a ton. In fact, we have a portion of one of the treads, just one of the endpoints of one of those treads, and that piece there alone weighs about 300 pounds. This thing is known as the crawler transporter. And the reason it's important is because hardware has to be assembled in that vehicle assembly building. Each piece has to be lifted up and put into place. So we do it there, but this configuration is sitting on top of this big gray box, which is called a mobile launch platform, which is exactly what it says. That's what it launches off of. So what happens is this platform is stored in a field right outside the VAB, as is the crawler transporter. When they're getting ready to do this, what's called stacking, the crawler will crawl underneath the mobile launch platform, pick it up, and carry it inside the VAB and set it down on these big pylons here, and then drive back out and wait in the field until it's ready for its next use. Now, the crawler transporter is powered by 2 big diesel engines, but not directly. In fact, you can tell they're big diesel engines because that silver cylindrical thing over there, That's one cylinder from that big engine, right? So they're giant engines, but they don't drive it directly. In fact, those big diesel engines turn turbo generators, electrical generators that produce electrical energy, and the electricity powers these little electric motors that actually drive the vehicle. This thing crawls along at about a half mile per hour. Okay, you can only drive in one direction or the other, you can't turn it around. So if you're driving it out to the launch pad, the operator sits in a little cab that's up at that end. When you're on your way back in the opposite direction, there's another little control cab here at this end. All right, so this thing brings the mobile launch platform into the VAB, sets it down, and we're ready to start stacking. Well, we didn't get to design this building, we bought it as is, and this was the only room where all this stuff fit. And so here we are. We've come full circle, we're back to the 1960s again, and this equipment was used in Launch Complex 36, which was used to launch Atlas boosters. And this equipment was actually used to launch between 1962 and 1995. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this equipment is you don't see any computer keyboards in front of it, do you? This equipment is all electromechanical. Basically, an engineer pulls a switch, the signal gets sent out to the vehicle on the launch pad, the vehicle responds, positive or negative, sends a signal back, and a green or a red light comes on, green light comes on, and they think it's ready to go. So we got a whole bunch of switches that have to be turned on before we can launch a vehicle. So these consoles are set up in a similar fashion to the shuttle. Each console represents one engineering system that's monitoring the vehicle as we prepare for launch. The flight director sits at the small console in the center of the room. He's sort of like the orchestra leader. He's leading this whole procedure to get that vehicle into space. Each of the engineers is sitting at his own console with this little tray table here, and he's got a launch procedure sitting in front of him on paper, in a loosely folded probably, and he goes through the procedure. The director is making sure everything happens in order, and as each engineer gets to his portion of something he has to do, he throws his switch and waits for something to happen. When all the green lights are all on, we know we're good to launch. The launch director presses the button, and the vehicle gets launched. Now these switches are interesting switches. When I have the kids in here, I like to get them up here and tell them to flip a switch for me, and none of them can. And the reason they can't is because you can't move these switches by just moving them. You have to actually pull them out and then move them. They're safety switches, and the reason they're like that is to make darn sure that no engineer ever threw a switch by accident. You want to make certain that he knows he wants to move that switch from one position to the other before he actually does it. And so they have to physically think, that's the switch, pull it out, and flip it. There's a countdown display up on the front in green, there's a countdown display up here in red.